There's a feature almost every camera has, a built-in cheat code that I can guarantee you're not using. This feature has transformed the way I shoot photos, and I can guarantee you once you start using it, your photos will instantly improve. If you're just starting out in photography and you're just getting the hang of shooting in manual, you're probably adjusting your settings until the scene looks good, or to a point where you're kind of just assuming you're not blowing out any highlights or underexposing the shadows. This is a super inaccurate way to judge exposure because your LCD brightness can be misleading. Or maybe you're someone who just uses the metering numbers, +1, -2. The problem with this, if you've never adjusted your metering settings, it's most likely set up to meter the entire scene. Now, on almost every camera, I know on Sony, if you cycle through your different displays, you'll find on one of the variations this. It kind of looks like a mountain, but this is your camera's histogram. The histogram is a much more reliable way to know if you're under or overexposing, and that's because you can essentially see all the information in your entire image in this tiny little graph. Here, let me explain what a histogram is and how to read it for those who don't know. On the far left, you have your shadows. In the middle, you have your midtones, and on the right, you have your highlights. When you're in the process of taking a photo, your histogram gives you a live look at your scene to quickly check your exposure. The height of these bars essentially tells you how many pixels in the image have that same brightness level. We're not really worried about that. What we're more so worried about is where all that information is on the histogram. So if you're shooting on a bright, snowy day like this, our histogram is actually going to be stacked up all the way to the right of the frame, indicating that we're overexposed or we're too bright. And we're actually going to lose a lot of the detail in our snow here. So let me just record this scene so you guys can see what I'm talking about. If we take a photo like this, it's going to be extremely bright, and you'll see that we won't be able to get a lot of that detail back in post. We can drop our ISO, we can increase our shutter speed, or even increase our aperture. That way we can just look at our highlights and bring them back towards the middle. That way we're not overexposed. So we'll drop our ISO, and you can see that all the information on the histogram is actually moving more to the middle, and this is where you actually want to take the photo. We're perfectly balanced in the middle, and we're getting a proper exposure, and we're actually going to be able to pull all the detail in our snow. It's also important you are shooting in RAW so that you can bring a lot of the details back if you happen to over or under expose your shot. Now, same thing goes for a dark scene like this. You can see that all of the information in our photo is crushed to the left side of the histogram, and we're probably not going to be able to bring back all of that detail in our shadows. So to make sure that we get a proper exposure, we can quickly adjust our settings. We can raise the ISO, we can drop our shutter speed or aperture to bring that histogram or all that information in our histogram closer to the middle. But what happens if you're shooting on a brighter day and there's a lot more contrast, lots of shadows and highlights? And if you favor your shadows, you blow out your highlights, and if you favor your highlights, you crush your shadows. The ideal situation is you want to balance everything to the middle of the histogram. You don't want either side to stack up. And you can do that in most situations, but at 12 o'clock noon on a super bright day, that's a little harder to do. So what do you do? Well, you may have heard people say you want to underexpose your RAW photos. The reason why you want to do this is RAW photos from these digital cameras retain a lot more detail in the shadows than they do in the highlights. If you happen to crush your shadows a little bit, there's a good chance that you can bring back a lot of that shadow detail in post. There may be a little bit of noise, but noise you can remove from some extent. Now, it doesn't really work so much the other way around. If you blow out your sky, unless you're shooting with 16-bit RAW files, most of the time you're not going to be able to get back a lot of that highlight detail. So in most cases where it's hard to properly expose for both, your best bet is to underexpose, which means you'll want to shift a lot of that information on the histogram to the left, or at least until your highlights are not blown out. Now, that being said, a perfectly balanced histogram doesn't have to apply to all photos. Getting your histogram perfect doesn't mean you're going to be shooting perfect photos all the time. And sometimes you want to intentionally blow out your highlights or crush your shadows, depending on the type of photo that you're taking. I've had times where the sky wasn't looking its best, and so I intentionally wanted to blow it out so that way I can get a lot more detail in my shadows. In those cases, I'm looking at my histogram, seeing that my shadows are on the left, and shifting them more into the middle by increasing my exposure. This ensures I'm getting as much detail in the shadows as I can, and in the process, I'm blowing out my highlights. Again, this is intentional. Now, when it comes to shooting video and shooting with a log color profile, we actually want to do the opposite. We want to expose to the right of the histogram without clipping our highlights so that we can capture a lot more detail and reduce the amount of noise that we get in the shadows in post. Log footage is a lot less forgiving than raw photos, and getting your exposure correct can completely change the final look of your video. Just take a look at these examples here filmed in this space. If you're struggling with exposing your photos, blowing out your highlights, crushing your shadows, or you're just not getting the amount of detail, color, and richness from your photos, there's a good chance you're just not exposing properly. So turn on that histogram, get out there and shoot photos. It might take some time to get used to or understand exactly how it's actually working, but once you get it, it will be like second nature. With that being said, let me know if you have any questions. Subscribe if you want to see more content like this. If you enjoyed the video or you learned something, make sure to drop a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.